One of the things that I want to ask myself this year was this question. How can I help you play your best golf this year? So when I sat down and said, okay, if that's my goal, if my goal is to help you play your best golf, what do I need to do? And I have an answer, and I want to share that with you tonight. That's going to be our purpose. Here's one of my contentions. If you want to get better, doing the same thing and expecting a different result is what we define as what? Insanity. Man, Einstein made that popular. If you do the same things and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. Here's what I want to do. I'm going to flip your current model of golf upside down. And I think when we do that, you're going to understand why a change in your approach is going to lead to a change in your results. In the 1976 Olympics, the United States got its butt kicked in medal count. So if you looked at the United States versus Russia, Russia had 50% more medals than the United States. So they started looking at the Russians and say, well, why is it that all of a sudden you're winning so many medals and so many gold medals and we're not? And they found an interesting thing. The Russians did two things. First thing they did was they brought more of their Olympic athletes together in one place. So that was one. They consolidated. The second thing that they did was they started to focus on performance. Well, interestingly enough, 2 years later, that began the formation of our Olympic Training Center. By 1992, as we started to focus and emphasize more performance, not just technique, but more performance, we pulled even, and the medal count was roughly even by 1992. In 1996, the model was completely upside down. We took home 50% more gold medals than the Russians. Here's another interesting thing. That back then in 1976, as we in the United States started to look at performance, that was actually the genesis of what we now call sports psychology. That's where it started, was how do we get our Olympic athletes to get a little bit better? So we call it sports psychology, but really it's all about performance. And what I'd like to do today is have you shift the way you think and stop thinking about golf in terms of a swing and start thinking about golf in terms of performance. My goal, if I was working with each one of you throughout this year, working on performance-based skills, would have you do lower your scores by 5 shots at least. That's for an average golfer. And shoot your career best round this year. And I think you could do it. Let's say I plotted all of your scores. Something that you would do if you did a handicap. And I just said, well, here's a line, and I'm going to start, and I'm going to plot on this line where all your scores are. If you looked at what that plot would look like over time, it would kind of look like a EKG chart, right? It's ups and downs and some little periods of good things, some good periods of time, some low periods of time. That would be what your performance would look like. At the end of that, what we do is we take your top 10 best scores, most recent, and the average, and we produce a handicap. So that's what your handicap looks like on average. So that's what your performance looks like. Well, what we wind up with then when we do that is a band. So we could say that there's times when I'm performing really well, and there's times when I'm not performing so well. And what we'd like to do, ideally, is be above our average line more often than below it. So as I started to do that and said, well, what are the activities that we do within the scope of all of these things, in fact, the whole scope of golf, then what emerged for me was a picture, and it's something that I call the athletic performance pyramid. So here we are, right? Peak performance at the top. The very best you could play in the zone. Well, what's interesting is you don't really need any help when you're in the zone. Well, that's as good as you can play, right? You're in the zone, things are going great. You don't really need any help. Right below that is an area we could call peak performance. Remember that chart from below? So up and down, up and down. Let's say below that we have an average level of what we would call just our basic performance. This is average. Here's where I am. And then we could even be a little bit lower. So just like we said there's an area we can go above normal performance into the zone, well, below average performance, there are other activities that we do that are related to our performance, but not necessarily the active performance, like a pre-shot routine, and then things like developing strategy. So these actually then form a hierarchy of things that are important. I mean, we'd all like to play here, right? What does it take to play here? Well, we're going to start to answer that. There are skills that come into play in peak performance. If those skills aren't here, you don't ever get into the zone. But then there are other things that are happening when we're at the low end of our performance. Well, when we're not performing, we're in our pre-shot and we're in our strategy. And then an even lower level of performance would be, let's say, things that we would do when we were planning or when we were practicing, because we're not even on the golf course when we're doing that. Well, one thing ought to jump out at you right away when you look at a chart and you organize activities by priority. Zone as good as we can get, right? What do we work on when we practice? Our swing mechanics, our technique, right? And yet, what do we do and what do we think about most of the time when we get out on the golf course? Our swing technique, our mechanics, right? So mechanics is at the far end of the performance pyramid, almost as far away as you can get from zone play. Wow. And yet, what do we do as teachers? So as teachers, and here's where I started to really ask this question, our typical approach is to start where? Right here with the golf swing, and then try to work up this way. I think that model is upside down. We try to say, here's how we can improve your swing. Sometimes as teachers, we don't even ask if it's improving your play. We just get you more and more towards the ideal swing. Well, there are a lot of ways to accomplish getting the ball in the hole. Not every swing has to be perfect, but it does need to be effective. So here's what I want you to think about instead, and that's turning the model upside down. If you take a performance-based approach, then the answer is, okay, what does it take? What am I doing when I'm playing my very best? And then look down the pyramid to say, well, what are the skills that I need to support that? Whereas when we teach swing and we teach golf or technique golf, what we do is we teach all these skills about the swing. Swing plane, elbow here, grip this way, and we try to force ourselves up the pyramid. I think what we should do instead is start at the end and work backwards. It's not just about the swing. So I like to think of the game in three parts. So think of it as a stool. So golf is supported by the swing, your strategy, and yourself. Remember that performance pyramid that I drew? At the very top, when you're in the zone, a lot of mental skills going on there. In the middle is strategy. And then at the very bottom is the swing. So am I saying there's no place for the swing? No, in fact, exactly the opposite. The broader your skill base is in terms of what you can do with your swing, the more stable your pyramid is. The easier it is for you to get to higher levels of play. So there's room for both. My point is, I don't think we should be exclusively focused on just the swing, trying to make the swing better. Should I do this way? Should I do it that way? I don't know. What happens to your ball? Let's start with the swing. Here are my priorities. If you want to look at the swing and you want to do anything to your golf swing, I think it should do one of these four things. Tell me how it improves one of these four things. Tell me how it improves your center contact. That's how well do you hit the ball in the middle of the club face. Secondly, how good does it improve, or how much does it improve your directional accuracy? Now here I mean just getting your ball from point A to point B. I'm not talking about shape. You can take any shape it wants. It could be on the ground, it could be up in the air, left to right, right to left. I'm just talking about getting it from point A to point B accurately. The same time, the same way. That's directional control. Third would be distance control. And then lastly is shape control. That's probably the one that we obsess on the most, especially when we make a shape that we don't want and we try to change that shape. Really the golf swing and the whole golf swing boils down to two things: impact and trajectory. But I think not enough people really quite understand what impact means, and not enough understand all of these components of trajectory. The first thing I would want you to start working on is your center contact. how well do you hit the ball with the middle of the club face? Now, in the PGA, we like to say centered contact, because actually we want it in the middle of the club face, and we also want the club face square. And then, if you do a good job with that, then you start working these right down in order, exactly the way they're presented right here. Let's break down the next one, which is strategy. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here today on strategy, but basically it boils down to two things. One is course navigation, and I call it course navigation, not course management, because I don't think you can manage a course, but you sure can navigate your way around it. And I got one simple rule of thumb, and that is make the next shot as easy as possible. The second part of this, to me, is game management. The intersection of these two form your strategy. Or you'll answer the question in course navigation, what's required of this? If I'm on my second shot and it's 148 yards, well, that's a course navigation issue. And then the game management is, what can I do? So what's required and what can I do? And by the time you put those two together, you have the foundation for strategy. Let me go to the third, and this is the self. 3 mental priorities. So remember, these all form the foundation for your golf game. Here they are. And these are actually what I call zone skills. So remember, we talked about being at the zone. Right underneath that, there's this area called peak performance. So the guys that study zone stuff, or being in the flow, have found, or they believe, that these 3 things are present virtually every time that you get into the zone. We don't really know why we get in the zone or how we get in the zone. It just seems to happen. But they do know that without these 3 things being present, you aren't going to get into the zone. So that's why I call them zone precursors, and very high-level skills. And they're primarily mental skills, but they're also performance skills. But here's what I wanted you to take away. Number one, I think probably the most valuable skill any golfer can develop is a target focus. I think this target focus is probably one of the main things that separates pros from guys who are on lower tours and pros from amateurs. It's their ability to retain and maintain a target focus. So there are 2 other skills I think that are important. One is called confidence. Now, in flow terms, we say that the shot that you have, or the activity that you're going to have, needs to be what's called a doable challenge. Well, if it's doable and it's a challenge, then you should be confident because you know that it's doable. The last is what I call present-centered. In flow terms, they like to say total task absorption. So those of you who have been in the zone and experienced it, and I think almost everybody has, recognize usually when it's after, it's like, wow, I had no awareness of anything else except what I was doing. But I think that's enough to go for today, just to start to think in terms of performance-based golf, not just swing-based golf.